Good afternoon. I'm Thomas Shaw. Welcome to the latest in our series, a Catechism of the Orthodox Church according to the Old Testament. We've now come to the great prophet Ezekiel, the major prophets. We've looked at Isaiah and Jeremiah. Now we're looking at Ezekiel, who was a contemporary with Jeremiah, but was part of the first wave that was taken to Babylon. Remember, we discussed there was a first wave and a second wave, and it was at the second wave that the city was destroyed and the temple violated. And then the third wave went to Egypt, and that's where Jeremiah went, virtually emptying the land. So Ezekiel opens with one of the more confusing passages of Scripture, discussing all sorts of faces and wheels, and we'll read this passage, but I wanted to provide some background in symbolism based on my own research. So what we're going to talk about for today and tomorrow is not from the Holy Fathers or from any canonical book on Orthodox symbols, but I think I'll show how it ties into those more canonical views. As we know in the iconography, the four faces that are encountered, and these are the face of a man, a lion, a calf, or a bull sometimes, and an eagle. These in classic iconography correspond to the four evangelists. And we'll talk about that a little later. But first, I want to give some background to what I think the solution to the problem of the four faces and the four wheels is. And to do that, we have to back up to something we talked about very early, and that's a stellar calendar. Remember, we talked about that there are four kinds of calendars: a lunar calendar, solar calendar, a state calendar, which only has a theoretical relationship to astronomy, and then finally the stellar calendar. We didn't talk much about that at that time, so I knew we were going to talk about it today. Now, stellar calendar is based on the year beginning with the heliacal rising of a star. Now, what this means when the star rises with the sun. So as the sun moves through the sky, against the background of the stars, different stars will rise with the sun day by day. And then the sun will continue to the east, moves more to the east, and those stars that rise with the sun thereafter are morning stars. There's a corresponding idea of the heliacal setting, and that's when the stars are evening stars, and then finally they go down with the sun and don't rise till sometime later. And the more the south the star is, the longer the interval between its heliacal setting and its heliacal rising. So that's the idea, is that it rises in the east with the sun and it becomes a morning star. So theoretically, any star could be used for this purpose. But in Egypt, very early on, they started taking note that the correspondence between the heliacal rising of Sirius, which is the brightest star in the sky, but it's quite a southern star. So it has a long period where it's not seen, and then suddenly it appears with the sun. And when that happens, it's around the time that the Nile rises. And of course, where the time when the Nile rises in Upper Egypt, which is to the south, is long before the Nile rises in the delta. So this is a fairly inaccurate kind of a measure, but the correspondence was strong enough that the Egyptians had two calendars. One was a state calendar, as we call it, or a civil calendar, a calendar that is not strongly tied to astronomy necessarily. And it had 365 exact days. It didn't have a leap year. In fact, it was Augustus Caesar who came in finally and adjusted the calendar of Egypt to have a leap year so it wouldn't go out of phase with the seasons, because the state calendar of Egypt lost one day every 4 years. But they also had another calendar based on Sirius, Sirius's heliacal rising, and that is called the Sothic calendar, because Sothis is the Egyptian word for Sirius. So when this rising then formed a separate calendar called the Sothic calendar, and the two calendars moved a little bit in relationship with one another, so that the civil calendar would come back into conjunction with the Sothic calendar approximately every 1400 years. So there's a long cycle of the relationship between these two calendars. So I need to make a second board and erase this one, because I need to draw a picture now of the sky when it came, of the rising of Sirius. Now we make the directions in a sky map. If we go with our normal east and west, the north is down here and the south is up here. This seems a little funny that the north is here and the south is here, but if you think about it for a minute, imagine you're looking north, the east is to your right and the west is to your left, and so forth. If you're looking east, the north is to your left and the south is to your right. So these cardinal directions are flipped a little in one way or the other to make a map of the sky. Now, Sirius would be rising over here. And when this calendar was devised, the lion Leo was rising with it over here. So here's the lion rising with Sirius over here. And what we found right here is is Orion, the man, about here, and Taurus, the bull, which could be interpreted as a calf, is right there. And the other is the eagle. Now the eagle is ultimately the constellation Aquila, but Aquila had set was off. But I think that what's being referring to is the star Lyra here. Lyra had been at the beginning of the Holocene, at the beginning of agriculture, was the North Star, and now it drifted way away from north over time, but it was the North Star, and its name, and it has this. Of course, this is. Lyra is the constellation. This is the star Vega. It's a live show. So this is the star Vega, and the meaning of Vega is that of a swooping eagle. Now, way back at the beginning of the Holocene, people practiced excarnation. And what they did was they put, and the American Indians did this too, is the dead would be put up on a platform for the uh, raptors, for the various kinds of birds that eat carrion to come and pick the bones clean. So Vega stood for the a bird that still nests on Mount Carmel in Israel, which is a kind of a buzzard called the griffin uh, eagle. Usually, you take a look at this. It's a very majestic bird, beautiful bird. Doesn't look, like those old buzzards in old cartoons. And one can imagine this huge bird swooping down, and this is what the word Vega implies. So this had been associated with a eagle, and also with the idea of taking the dead to the North Star, Vega being the North Star back then. I've discovered that some of the, and we'll get into this more when we discuss Spica tomorrow, that some of the key stars, their meanings go back to the very beginning of agriculture. And you might say, well, how can that be? How could things survive that long? And yet, don't we still read in our paper? Don't you pick up the paper and see the horoscope and it says, oh, you're Virgo, and here's a Virgo. And people don't even realize that things have moved on. The dates associated with those constellations are frozen in time from 2,000 years ago. And this is the way symbols often work. They get stuck. They get ritualized. They get the symbols are take on a life of their own, and they no longer correspond to their original setting that gave them a sense of. You could see why you called this thing that, and yet they persist. They persist. So the idea of the Vega being this eagle persists to this day in Vega, the name Vega, if you look up its meaning and etymology. So here we have the eagle, the lion, the man, and the calf. And right here is Perseus with his sword. Now you'll notice, and I'll highlight this when we go through the text of Ezekiel, that there are two places he talks about the four faces. And in the second one, he doesn't mention the calf. He mentions a cherub. And you'll recall that the cherub in Eden is holding a sword. And there's a whole section of Ezekiel which talks about the sword. The sword is a very important concept here. Why? Because Ezekiel's a priest, and he has in all of the symbolic connections with the sky were part of the priestly tradition. Why does the priest care about a sword? Because he used the sword to kill what? The bulls, the calves. And if we're looking at the sky towards the south, then the sword is right in the zenith. Remember, we talked about the zenith being an important location in connection with the god Anu in Sumeria. It was right in the zenith is the sword, and below the sword is the bull. Like the priest is above. This could represent a priest who's above the bull. And then what's below the bull is Cetus, which is Leviathan, the sea monster. Cetus meaning whale. So we have this sword, bull, whale, these very important biblical symbols lined up on this north-south line, which is called the meridian uh, if you're into terms used in astronomy. So this is our this is the sky as it would look around 3600 BC with the rising of Sirius. Now, at the time that Ezekiel's writing, though, this Sirius no longer rises with the lion. Now it rises with Cancer. So this sequence is gone. So why are these symbols still important? It's because this is the midnight sky of the Day of Atonement. And it's the position of the sun here at the time of the Passover. This is where the sun is. This sky is obscured. This is the blue sky. But if you're a Jerusalem priest and it's Passover and you look at the sun at the sky up at noon, you know it's up there is Perseus, the sword, the bull, the Leviathan, all those things, because the sky 6 months apart are opposite skies. Where the sun is right now will be revealed fully in the midnight sky 6 months from now. So this sky, even though its origin of these symbols in Egypt, where we end up with the Sphinx, we have the Sphinx. He's got the body of a lion. He's got the face of a man, and so forth. That's related to the Sothic calendar, but the continuation of these symbols going together, lion or bull and man and eagle, often being combined into a single image, as we'll see as we read in Ezekiel, where he has his vision. These are all visions of the theophany, of what? Of the renewal of creation in the new year. In the case of the Egyptians, it was the new year of the Sothic year, the rising of the Nile. The Nile would rise, and then it would inundate the land with all of the silt from upriver, and this was how the land was fertilized, and why the Nile Valley, at least in the narrow strip of it where the Nile was able to flood it, remained a rich agricultural resource for thousands of years. It's because of the renewal of the land through the flooding of the Nile. So this symbol, this particular sky with the sword, which is Ezekiel calls the cherub, the bull, the man in Orion, the Leviathan, the eagle, and the lion rising is a very persists in its importance and is passed on to other cultures. In the mix of cultures that comes in the late Bronze Age, we find symbols flowing back and forth. For instance, originally the winged sun, and this could very well refer to this configuration as Vega is the wings, the sun's rising in Leo. So this is the winged sun symbol, is an ancient Egyptian symbol that then became, in the Iron Age, a symbol for the Assyrians. So we find Hezekiah in his royal seals changing from an Egyptian when he had his brief, if you'll recall, pro-Egyptian period before. This is always what happens in these stories in the Old Testament, that the king doesn't want to pay the tribute to Assyria or Babylon and turns to Egypt. So in the case of Hezekiah turning to Egypt, Isaiah tells him not to. Same thing with Jeremiah, with Zedekiah wanting to turn to Egypt. And Jeremiah says, don't do this because it's not going to work. he uh, signals his shift back to being an Assyrian vassal by changing the symbol on his seal from a scarab beetle, because the Egyptians had the idea that the sun was like a scarab beetle. Scarab beetle is a dung beetle. It pushes a little ball of dung around with it. So they looked at that and they said, well, that's like the sun. The little ball's like the sun. So a scarab beetle symbolizes the sun. He switched from a scarab beetle to a winged sun because the Assyrians by now had adopted the winged sun as their thing, their symbol. It had been taken from the Egyptians. So these symbols pass back and forth, up and down. And of course, we've pointed out that Judea is right on the crossroads. So all these symbols would pass through there. So the priests of the temple couldn't help but notice that on atonement at midnight, this configuration would occur, and these same and that the animals and the figures that went into the making up the cherubim, which were the throne of God, were present in the sky in the midnight sky of atonement. So the fall holiday sequence, particularly, is related to the sighting of what we might call the heavenly cherubic throne. And there actually is a throne over here about, and that throne is the constellation Cepheus, which also is a North Star, very far in the distant past, and may be continue this symbolism of the throne of God being the North Star long after. And it gets associated in our in the Greek mythology connected with the constellations. Cepheus is the father Cassiopeia, who is tied to a rock and is going to be fed to the sea beast, right? It is a child sacrifice, and Perseus comes along and saves Cassiopeia from the sea beast. So this drama is played out in the sky with Cetus, Perseus being the sword, and the cherub all being the same constellation. And now this once figure of the throne of God, which, because it was once in the North Star position, is now the throne of the father of Cassiopeia, Cepheus. It's how we can see how these ideas that can be passed on very easily for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, as long as the cultural memory remains unbroken. So tomorrow we'll pick up again. This is a very brief overview, but the main takeaway is this: that the night sky of atonement is the basis for the cherubim. The symbol of the cherubim, which is what all this is about really, is from the night sky of atonement. These things aren't random. They're being, even though the origin of these symbols, in my view, goes back into ancient Egypt, and why we find a correspondence between the symbols in Egypt. The direct transmission of the connection is with the ritual of the atonement. So tomorrow we're going to look at another very important heliacal rising, which is that of spica in its connection to the atonement as well. Thank you. See you tomorrow.